It's been 10 years since the Arab Spring shook the Middle East. Starting in 2011, anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions began across much of the Arab world, all in response to oppressive regimes and low standards of living. Egypt and Tunisia's dictators were toppled, but the revolutionary wave descended into bloody civil war in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Syria and Iraq became synonymous with devastating conflict, refugee camps, and foreign meddling, but the chaos elsewhere turned several Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, into a center of relief as expats were lured by their soaring wealth and prosperity. And now, a decade later, the Gulf monarchies have filled the Middle East power vacuum. Well, joining us now for more on this is Ryan Bolla, Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor. So Ryan, give us a quick history lesson on the Arab Spring. What exactly happened in its very beginning? Now, some experts say that calling these uprisings the Arab Spring is a mislabel. Why is that the case?
Well, we'll start with that quick history. As you mentioned in the opener, this was a pent-up social and political frustration that essentially boiled over in 2010 and 2011. And I was living in the region at the time when the outbreak of protests at Tunisia started up. And many Arab expatriates that I worked alongside at the time were dismissive of these first efforts. They believed that these would ebb and fall apart just as other protest movements have in the past. What was different this time, however, is that social media, regular media like Al Jazeera and the internet connected Arabs together in a way they never had been before. And there was a level of solidarity and organization that allowed these protest movements to really overcome a lot of the traditional barriers that these states had built up over the decades to try to keep themselves from being overwhelmed by these very types of movements. So it began as something of a contagion in Tunisia, and it moved very quickly into Egypt. And once Egypt's revolution kicked off and Hosni Mubarak resigned in February 2011, this proved to many Arabs throughout the region that these somewhat, they were seen as impenetrable regimes, could in fact be toppled. And then this inspired the social movements that spread out to Libya, to Syria, to an extent in Lebanon and Iraq, that have all given us reverberating consequences to this day. Now, calling it the Arab Spring, that might be a bit of a misnomer in terms of the notion of the Arab Spring was that it was supposed to bring about an era of democratic and political change with lasting and mostly positive consequences. But for the most part, the Arab Spring has resulted in a number of civil wars, of lingering social unrest, economic depression, and the only success story so far really is Tunisia's democracy.
Right. That brings us to our next question. I mean, it's been 10 years now since the Arab Spring shook the region. What countries have suffered the most here?
Well, I guess that's an arguable measurement there about which ones have had the most impact or which ones have fallen apart the furthest. There is the argument that it could be either Syria, Libya, or Yemen in different extents. In my personal opinion, I think Syria has endured the greatest human consequences from the civil war, because within that civil war, not only is it the highest body count with the most international implications and reverberations with the Russians, Iranians, Americans, French, and Turks having all gone in at varying points, it has also led to a regime that has not been changed at all, that has in fact doubled down on many of its authoritarian impulses and is now poised to take back much of the country, having weathered this crisis. So in many respects, I believe that Syria is probably your worst case scenario for what happened with the spring.
Now, today we are seeing a very different Middle East. How did the Gulf countries establish themselves as, you could say, the Middle East center of gravity?
Well, there was an interesting split early on between the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. Qatar decided to embrace many of the social movements and revolutions through its media programming on Al Jazeera, as well as through direct state funding to certain chapters and political parties. The Qataris decided to take a gamble that if they were on the side of change, change would be less likely to come to Qatar, or if it did come to Qatar, they would be able to control it better. They were afraid of an out-of-control, runaway series of revolutions that might one day end up in Doha. The Emiratis, on the other hand, took the idea that these revolutions were destabilizing and were more likely to bring enemies to power than friends. And so the Emiratis, as well as to a certain extent the Bahrainis, began to do a regional push as a counter-revolutionary movement. So the Qataris rolled up very quickly and supported the post-revolutionary government of Egypt as it was run by the Muslim Brotherhood, because they believed that in doing so, they would gain a friend out of Egypt, and that would allow them to control the changes that Egypt might inspire. The Emiratis and the Saudis, on the other hand, supported the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF group in Egypt that made up the military, and waited for an opportunity to provide them with the support they needed to overthrow the democratically elected government of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that was how it broke down, is that there was a delineation between the Qataris and the Emiratis on one hand, by trying to push their ideologies and push the way that they wanted to see these revolutions and these social changes evolve over time. They moved into many of these power vacuums in an attempt to control events on the ground. But as history has played out over the past 10 years, they've actually had a little bit of a limited effect on the final stories being told there.